Please, I mean no harm. We just want to help.
When Lydia Harrow, a 63-year-old waitress struggling to survive, quietly paid for a meal for a disabled child and her father, she had no idea this simple act of kindness would change everything. The man she helped was hiding a dangerous past. And when strangers invaded her home claiming ownership through fake documents, he would call upon his former brotherhood to repay an old debt. What happens next will restore your faith in humanity. Like this video if you believe in second chances, subscribe for more inspiring stories, and comment what city you're watching from. The rain fell in thin sheets across Maple Ridge, turning the asphalt into a mirror that reflected the dim streetlights. Lydia Harrow pulled her worn cardigan tighter around her shoulders as she climbed the wooden steps to her front porch, each board groaning under her tired feet. The scent of wet wood and old paint filled her nostrils, familiar and comforting. After another 12-hour shift at Murphy's Diner, her keys jingled softly as she reached for the lock. But something was wrong. Light spilled from beneath her front door. Warm, electric light where there should have been darkness. Lydia's hand trembled as she turned the handle, finding it unlocked. The door swung open to reveal 3 strangers sitting in her living room. A young man with gold teeth lounged in her late husband's recliner, boots propped up on the coffee table she'd had for 30 years. 2 others stood by her kitchen, one rifling through her refrigerator, while the other examined papers spread across her dining table. "Well, look who finally showed up," the man in the chair said, not bothering to look at her. His voice carried the sharp edge of the city, foreign in her small mountain town. Granny's home from work. Lydia's breath caught in her throat. The familiar weight of exhaustion in her bones suddenly felt heavier, mixed with something cold and sharp. "Excuse me, but this is my home. I think there's been a mistake." The man by the refrigerator laughed, pulling out one of her beers and popping it open. "No mistake, lady. We got the paperwork right here." He gestured to the documents with the bottle, foam spilling onto her linoleum. "House belongs to Meridian Properties now." "You're trespassing." "That's impossible." Lydia's voice cracked like autumn leaves. She took a small step forward, her worn sneakers squeaking against the floor. "I've lived here for 22 years. I have the deed." "Had the deed," the man in the chair corrected, finally looking at her with eyes that held no warmth. "Past tense, Granny. You defaulted on some payments, didn't read the fine print. And now it's our problem to deal with squatters like you." The refrigerator hummed loudly in the sudden silence, a sound Lydia had never noticed before, but now seemed deafening. The stranger's presence had changed everything in her home, even the familiar sounds. The front door hung open behind her, letting in the damp night air that made her shiver. Through the kitchen window, she could see Mrs. Chen's curtains twitch in the house next door. Old Mr. Martinez's porch light flickered on, then off again. Her neighbors were watching, but nobody came to help. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, suddenly nobody wanted to get involved. "Look, we ain't monsters," the third man said, his tone mockingly gentle. "We'll give you till morning to pack your stuff and get out. After that, well," he shrugged, the gesture somehow more threatening than any raised voice. Lydia gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white against the painted wood. The metal button on her work apron, number 47, tarnished and old, pressed against her ribs as she breathed. It had been her husband's, something he'd told her to keep safe, though she'd never understood why. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the roof with increasing urgency. Water dripped from her gray hair onto her shoulders. But she didn't move from the doorway. This was her home, the place where she'd nursed her husband through his final illness, where she kept his memory alive in every carefully dusted photograph and unchanged corner. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she whispered, the words barely audible over the storm. "Not our problem," the man with the gold teeth replied, picking up the remote and changing the channel on her television. "But hey, there's a nice bridge about 2 miles down Route 9. Heard it's got good shelter." Their laughter followed her as she stepped back into the rain, pulling the door closed behind her. The lock clicked with a finality that echoed in her chest. Lydia stood on her own porch, rain soaking through her cardigan, staring at the door that had welcomed her home for over 2 decades. In the distance, a car engine started. Mrs. Chen's curtains were still now. The mountain town that had been her sanctuary for so long suddenly felt vast and empty, full of strangers who wore familiar faces but offered no help when she needed it most. The cold metal of the button pressed against her skin as she breathed, and for the first time in years, she remembered her husband's words about protection and numbers that mattered. But standing alone in the rain, those words felt as distant as everything else she'd lost. The fluorescent lights in Murphy's diner buzzed overhead as Lydia tried to explain the situation to Frank, the night manager. Her uniform was still damp from the rain, and she kept pulling at the fabric where it clung uncomfortably to her skin. The coffee maker gurgled behind the counter, filling the empty diner with its familiar rhythm. "Look, Lydia, that sounds rough and all," Frank said without looking up from his paperwork. "But I can't have my waitresses bringing their personal drama to work. Customers notice when staff ain't focused." She watched his pen move across the schedule, scratching out names and writing in new ones. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet diner. "Frank, I just need somewhere to stay for a few nights while I figure this out. I could sleep in the back booth. Wouldn't bother anybody. Can't do it. Liability issues." His tone carried the dismissive weight of someone who'd made up his mind before the conversation started. "Maybe try the Salvation Army up in Asheville. They might have something." Asheville was 40 miles away. Lydia's car had been making strange noises for weeks, and she barely had enough gas money to get to work and back. She nodded anyway, knowing Frank was already done with the conversation. Outside, the rain had softened to a fine mist that hung in the air like suspended tears. Lydia sat on the wooden bench Frank kept for employees on their breaks, the paint peeling under her hands. The parking lot stretched empty before her, asphalt gleaming wet under the security lights. She pulled her apron straight and felt the button again. 47 etched into tarnished metal. Her husband Robert had pressed it into her palm the night before he died, his weathered fingers covering hers. "If you ever need help, real help, this number means something. There are good men who remember debts." At the time, she'd thought it was the morphine talking. Robert had always been a practical man, not given to mysterious gestures or cryptic warnings, but he'd been insistent, making her promise to keep it safe, to remember what he'd told her. A car passed by slowly, its headlights sweeping across the wet pavement. Inside, she glimpsed a large man driving with careful attention, and beside him, a small figure in the passenger seat. The car paused at the stop sign longer than necessary, and she thought she saw the driver's eyes find her through the darkness before he pulled away. The mist settled on her graying hair like dewdrops. She turned the button over in her fingers, feeling the worn edges where Robert's thumb had rubbed it smooth over the years. On the back, scratched in tiny numbers that she'd never noticed before, was a phone number with a local area code. Mrs. Chen's words from years ago echoed in her memory. "That Robert of yours, he wasn't always a maintenance man. Had some interesting friends before you met him." Lydia had laughed it off then. Robert was the gentlest man she'd ever known, steady as mountain stone and twice as reliable. The diner's neon sign flickered, casting pink and blue shadows across the parking lot. A train whistle sounded in the distance, lonesome and low, carrying freight through the mountain passes to places where people had fresh starts and second chances. Lydia stood up slowly, her joints protesting after the long shift. The phone number seemed to burn against her fingertip as she traced it. Robert had never lied to her in 31 years of marriage, never made a promise he couldn't keep. The payphone by the diner's entrance looked older than the hills, its metal receiver scarred and dented, but when she picked it up, the dial tone hummed clear and strong. Her finger hovered over the first number, then began to dial. Each digit echoed through the empty night like a prayer. The phone rang 3 times before a gruff voice answered. "Yeah." Lydia's throat went dry. I'm looking for someone who might know about the number 47. Silence stretched across the line, heavy with unspoken weight. She could hear breathing, careful and measured, and the distant sound of tools clinking in the background. "Who's asking?" "My name is Lydia Harrow. My husband was Robert Harrow, and he told me—" "Jesus." The voice changed completely, rough edges smoothing into something like reverence. "Robert's Lydia." "Ma'am, my name is Jonah Pike, your husband. He saved my life once. Saved all our lives, really." Tears she didn't expect started burning behind her eyes. "He never told me much about his past. Robert was good that way. Kept the ugly stuff where it belonged. Behind him." She heard the man moving, the sound of a chair creaking. "Where are you, ma'am? Are you safe?" 20 minutes later, she watched headlights cut through the mist as 4 vehicles pulled into Murphy's parking lot. The lead truck was a weathered blue pickup that looked like it had seen honest work, followed by a small sedan, a motorcycle that purred rather than roared, and a newer SUV. Jonah Pike climbed out of the pickup first, a man in his late 50s with graying hair and hands stained permanently with motor oil. Behind him came 3 others, A tall black man with kind eyes and a teacher's careful posture. A compact Hispanic man who moved with the quiet efficiency of medical training. And a younger guy with calculator eyes and clothes that said accountant more than outlaw. "Mrs. Harrow?" Jonah's voice was gentler in person than it had been on the phone. "These are the others Robert helped. Reese Calder, Tomas Velez, and Dawson Clive." Each man nodded respectfully, but she saw something deeper in their eyes. A shared history that ran through their cores like veins of ore through mountain rock. These weren't the dangerous men she'd expected. They were fathers and workers and community members, but underneath lay the bedrock of loyalty that time hadn't eroded. "Robert never mentioned names," Reese said quietly. His voice carried the measured cadence of someone used to reaching troubled youth. "But he talked about his wife sometimes. Said you had a good heart, that you fed stray cats and always left tips for restaurant workers even when money was tight. We disbanded the group almost 10 years ago," Jonah explained. "Went our separate ways, built different lives, but some debts don't expire. What Robert did for us, that number you carry means something." Tomas stepped forward, his medical instincts reading the exhaustion in her posture. "Ma'am, when's the last time you ate something? You look ready to drop." The kindness in his voice broke something loose inside her chest. "I don't understand any of this. I just lost my house. I might lose my job. And I found a phone number on a button my husband gave me before he died." Dawson pulled a small notebook from his shirt pocket. "Tell us about the house. Start from the beginning." As she spoke, the four men listened with the focused attention of people who understood that details mattered. That truth lived in the spaces between words. When she finished, Jonah was already reaching for his phone. "We'll handle this," he said simply. "Robert kept our families together when everything was falling apart. Now it's our turn to keep his together." The mist had lifted, leaving the night clear and full of stars that seemed closer than they had in years. Dawn broke gray and soft over Maple Ridge as the convoy of vehicles pulled up to Lydia's house. The strangers' cars were gone from her driveway, but yellow tape stretched across her front door like a bureaucratic spiderweb. Neighbors' curtains twitched with curiosity as four middle-aged men climbed out to survey the scene. Elias Rowan had been restless all night, haunted by the image of the elderly woman sitting alone in the diner parking lot, when Jonah called before sunrise, asking him to meet at an address in town. Something in his friend's voice made him leave Mila with his neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez without question. Now, standing in front of the small blue house with its peeling paint and carefully tended flower boxes, he understood. This was about honor, the kind that lived deeper than law, older than paperwork. "They did a number on her, didn't they?" Reese murmured, examining the notice tacked to the door. His teacher's eye caught details others missed. The way someone had left the front door slightly ajar to let moisture in, the deliberately scattered papers visible through the window. Lydia emerged from Jonah's truck, moving like someone afraid to hope. In daylight, Elias could see the strength in her weathered hands and the steel in her spine. Even bent with exhaustion, she wore the same waitress uniform from the night before, now wrinkled and damp. "I called my lawyer friend in Asheville," Dawson said, holding up his phone. "Sarah Martinez. She handles housing disputes. She's driving down this morning to look at your papers." "I can't afford a lawyer," Lydia said quietly. "You're not paying for one," Jonah replied. "We are." Mrs. Chen appeared on her front porch, wrapping a thin robe around herself. "Lydia, are you all right, dear? I saw those men yesterday, but I didn't know what to do." Frank called. "Looking for you." The mention of her boss made Lydia's shoulders tense. "I was supposed to work the breakfast shift." "We'll handle Frank too," Elias said, surprising himself with the protectiveness in his voice. This woman had fed his daughter when they had nothing, asked no questions, expected no thanks. Nobody's losing their job over this. Tomas approached the front door with the careful movement of someone assessing a patient. The lock's been changed, but they left it open on purpose. Classic intimidation tactic. Let the elements damage the interior so you can claim abandonment. "How do you know all this?" Lydia asked. The four men exchanged glances weighted with shared history. "We weren't always mechanics and teachers and nurses," Reese said gently, "but that's behind us now. What matters is, we know how these people think." A pickup truck rumbled down the street, slowing as it passed the house. The driver, a man in an expensive jacket that didn't match the vehicle, watched them for a long moment before continuing. Elias memorized the license plate without conscious thought, old habits surfacing like muscle memory. "They're checking on their handiwork," Dawson observed, making notes in his phone. "Probably taking photos to document deterioration." Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, though the morning wasn't particularly cold. "This feels like a nightmare I can't wake up from." "We've all had those," Jonah said simply. "But nightmares end when good people decide they've had enough." Mrs. Chen walked over, carrying a steaming cup. "Coffee," she said, pressing it into Lydia's hands. "And don't you worry about Frank. My nephew works for the health department. Might be time for a surprise inspection of that diner's kitchen." Elias watched Lydia's face change as she realized she wasn't facing this alone. Color returned to her cheeks, and she straightened slightly, the way flowers did when they finally got rain. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "You don't even know me." "Your husband knew us," Tomas answered. "And yesterday at the diner, you knew Mila." Lydia looked puzzled, until Elias explained. "You paid for our breakfast, made sure my daughter had extra food to take home. You didn't know who we were, but you saw someone who needed help and you gave it. That's just basic human decency." "Exactly," Reese said with a smile. "And that's rarer than you think." Sarah Martinez arrived in a dust-covered Honda Civic, her briefcase worn soft with age, and her handshake firm enough to crack walnuts. She spread Lydia's documents across the hood of Jonah's truck while the morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last of the mist. "This is garbage," she announced after 10 minutes of reading. "Fraudulent signatures, backdated documents, and they're claiming you defaulted on a mortgage modification that doesn't exist in any county records." Dawson peered over her shoulder, his accounting background making sense of the financial maze. "Look at this. They claim she missed payments in July, but her bank statements show automatic withdrawals that cleared without issues. Someone's running a foreclosure mill," Sarah continued. "They target elderly homeowners, create false debt documentation, then move quickly before anyone can respond. It's happening all over the state." Lydia stared at the papers as if they were written in a foreign language. "But how can they just lie like that? Don't the police check these things?" "Police handle criminal matters," Sarah explained gently. "This looks like civil paperwork on the surface. By the time anyone realizes it's fraud, the house has usually been flipped or demolished." Elias felt his hands curl into fists and forced them to relax. The old anger was still there, ready to burn everything in its path, but that wasn't who he was anymore. That wasn't what Mila needed from him. "So what's our next move?" he asked. "We document everything, file emergency injunctions, and start building a case, but that takes time, and they're probably counting on Mrs. Harrow not having the resources to fight back." Reese had been quiet, studying the house with a teacher's attention to detail. "They made one mistake," he said suddenly. "They assumed she was alone." Tomas checked his watch. "I need to get to the clinic, but I can make some calls. I know people at legal aid, maybe the Attorney General's office too." "I should call Frank," Lydia said, though her voice suggested she'd rather eat glass. "No need," Jonah replied, holding up his phone. "Just got off the phone with Murphy's corporate office in Charlotte. Seems Frank's been skimming from the registers for months. Health department's doing a surprise inspection this afternoon. And I'd bet they'll find enough violations to keep him busy." Lydia's eyes widened. "How did you—" "Like I said, we weren't always mechanics and teachers," Jonah said with a slight smile. "We know how to make phone calls." A white sedan pulled up across the street, parking where the driver could watch the house. The same expensive jacket, different car. Elias committed the plate number to memory and noticed Dawson doing the same. "They're getting nervous," Sarah observed. "That's good. Nervous people make mistakes." Mrs. Chen emerged from her house again, this time carrying a plate covered with aluminum foil. "Breakfast," she announced, as if armed legal standoffs were normal Tuesday morning activities. "And I called my sister Rosa. She works at the courthouse. Says there's been a lot of these foreclosure cases lately, all from the same law firm." "Which firm?" Sarah asked sharply. "Meridian something. They always seem to be in a hurry, never let people ask questions." The pieces clicked together in Dawson's mind like tumblers in a lock. "Meridian Properties," he said. "That's who claimed ownership of your house. Mrs. Harrow, they're not just forging documents. They're running the whole operation." Lydia sat down heavily on her front steps, the weight of revelation settling on her shoulders. "So this is really happening to other people too." "Probably dozens," Sarah confirmed. "But now we know their pattern, and patterns can be broken." The man in the white sedan started his engine and drove away, but not before taking several photographs of the group with a telephoto lens. "Let him look," Elias said quietly. "We're not doing anything wrong." But as the car disappeared around the corner, he found himself thinking about Mila, about the life they'd built in their small apartment. about how quickly safety could disappear when powerful people decided you were in their way. Some fights, he realized, found you whether you wanted them or not. By afternoon, the small blue house had become command central for an operation none of them had planned, but all understood. Sarah Martinez worked from the kitchen table, her laptop surrounded by legal documents and coffee cups. Neighbors dropped by with stories, casseroles, and moral support that felt substantial as mountain bedrock. Lydia stood in her living room for the first time since the invasion, breathing in the scent of her own space, lavender sachets and old wood, and the faint trace of Robert's aftershave that somehow lingered in the furniture after all these years. Seeing it empty but intact gave her strength she didn't know she still possessed. "They changed my locks, but they didn't take my life," she said quietly, running her fingers along the mantelpiece where her wedding photo still sat undisturbed. Frank appeared at the front door like a storm cloud, his face red with contained fury. "Lydia, what the hell do you think you're doing? You missed your shift. Corporate's crawling all over my diner. And now I got health inspectors finding problems that weren't there yesterday." Jonah emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel with deliberate calm. "Frank, is it? We were just talking about you." Something in Jonah's voice made Frank take a step backward. "Look, I don't know what kind of game you people are running, but Lydia's been stealing from the register for months. I got documentation." "Funny thing about documentation," Dawson interrupted, appearing beside Jonah with a manila folder. "Sometimes it tells a different story than people expect." Frank's bravado cracked slightly. "I don't know what you're implying." "I'm not implying anything," Dawson said pleasantly. "I'm stating facts, like how your personal ATM withdrawals coincide perfectly with reported register shortages, or how you've been charging employees for uniforms that corporate says should be provided free." Elias watched Frank's face cycle through anger, confusion, and fear. This was how bullies always looked when someone finally pushed back. Smaller than their reputation, weaker than their threats. "Lydia," Frank said, his tone shifting to mock friendliness, "you don't want to get mixed up with people like this. I'm trying to help you here. If you come back to work tomorrow, forget this whole mess. Maybe we can work something out." For a moment, Lydia hesitated. 40 years of being told to keep quiet, to not make waves, to be grateful for whatever crumbs fell from other people's tables. It was a hard habit to break. Then she thought about Mila Rowan, struggling with her fork while her father counted pocket change, and how natural it had felt to help. She thought about Robert, who'd faced his own darkness and chosen light. She thought about the button in her apron, and the phone call that had brought these unlikely guardians to her door. "No," she said quietly. "No, I don't think I will." Frank's face flushed darker. "You'll regret this. You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," Reese said from the doorway, "I think you're the one who doesn't understand the situation." He held up his phone, which had been recording the entire conversation. Threats against employees, attempted coercion, and some very interesting admissions about documentation. "I teach at-risk youth, Frank. I know how to recognize predatory behavior." Frank left without another word, his expensive shoes slapping against the wet pavement like angry exclamation points. "I've never said no to a boss before," Lydia admitted, her voice shaky with adrenaline. "How does it feel?" Tomas asked gently. She considered the question seriously, testing the sensation like probing a healing wound. "Terrifying," she said finally. "And wonderful, Mrs." Chen appeared with another plate of food, because in crisis or celebration, food was love made tangible. "My Rosa says Meridian Properties filed 12 foreclosure cases this month alone, all targeting elderly homeowners. All following the same pattern." Sarah looked up from her laptop. "We need to contact those other families. If we can prove this is systematic fraud, we can file a class action suit. I know someone at the newspaper," Reese offered. "This kind of story, predatory targeting of seniors, it gets attention." "Attention is good," Jonah agreed. "But we need to be smart about timing. Push too hard too fast, and they'll destroy evidence and disappear." Elias understood the delicate balance they were walking. In his old life, problems got solved with fast action and intimidation, but that world had been built on fear, and fear always collapsed eventually. This careful building of community and documentation and legal pressure, this could last. "What do you need me to do?" Lydia asked. The question hung in the air like sunlight through stained glass, beautiful and transformative. This wasn't a woman asking to be rescued anymore. This was someone ready to fight. The Maple Ridge Community Center hadn't seen this much activity since the annual church bake-off. By Thursday evening, the main hall buzzed with quiet conversations as elderly residents compared documents and shared stories. Dawson had created a wall-sized chart that looked like something from a detective show, complete with photographs, timelines, and red string connecting related events. 12 families in 3 months, he announced to the assembled group. Same law firm, same false documentation, same pressure tactics. They're operating like a machine. Lydia studied the faces in the photographs. Men and women her age who wore the same expression of bewildered loss she'd seen in her own mirror. Mrs. Patterson from Oak Street, who'd lost her house in August. Mr. Valdez from the trailer park, whose manufactured home had been repossessed despite current payments. The Martinez family from Pine Ridge, now living in their car while fighting foreclosure proceedings. The pattern is always the same, Sarah explained to the crowd. They target homes in improving neighborhoods, create false debt documentation, then move fast through compliant courts before anyone can mount a defense. Mila Rowan sat in the front row, her leg braces gleaming under the fluorescent lights as she colored quietly in a notebook. Elias had wanted to leave her with Mrs. Rodriguez, but Mila had insisted on coming. "I want to see the lady who helped us," she'd said with 8-year-old logic that brooked no argument. Now she looked up at Lydia with serious brown eyes. "Are the bad people going to take your house?" The question cut through legal terminology and adult complications to the heart that mattered. "I don't know, sweetheart," Lydia answered honestly, "but a lot of good people are trying to help. Like Daddy and his friends." "Yes, like your daddy and his friends." Jonah had been quiet most of the evening, but now he stood with the careful deliberation of someone choosing words that would matter. "I want to tell you all something. The men standing with me tonight, we haven't always been the people you see now. We made mistakes, hurt people, did things we're not proud of." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. In small towns, reputation was currency, and admitting to a criminal past was like declaring bankruptcy. But Mrs. Harrow's husband Robert saw something in us worth saving. He didn't have to help. Hell, he had good reason not to. But he chose to anyway, and that choice changed everything. Reese stepped forward. "Now I teach kids who remind me of who I used to be. Angry, scared, convinced the world is against them. I try to show them what Robert showed us, that you don't have to stay what you started as. I'm a nurse now," Tomas added. "I patch people up instead of tearing them down, but I remember what it feels like to be powerless, to watch people with money and connections take everything you have." The room was silent except for the distant hum of traffic and the scratch of Mila's crayon against paper. "These Meridian people," Dawson said quietly, "they think they can steal from you because you're alone, because you don't have connections, because nobody will believe your word against their lawyers." He gestured to the chart behind him. "They're wrong." Mrs. Chen stood up from her seat near the back. "My nephew says the State Attorney General's office has been looking for evidence of foreclosure fraud. If we can prove these cases are connected, we can bring down the whole operation," Sarah finished. "But it means going public, fighting in court, putting your stories on record." An elderly man near the door raised a shaky hand. "What if they come after us for talking, these people? They don't seem like the type to give up easy." It was Elias who answered, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who'd faced down real danger and lived to tell about it. "Then they'll have to come through us first." Mila looked up from her coloring book. "Daddy, what's that word you taught me? When people help each other." "Community," he said softly. "Community," she repeated, testing the syllables. "I like that word." Outside, the first autumn leaves rattled against the windows like nature's applause. Change was coming to Maple Ridge. The kind that started in meeting halls and spread to courtrooms and newspaper headlines. The kind that reminded powerful people that sometimes, the powerless decided they'd had enough. Friday morning brought reporters. The Charlotte Observer had picked up the story. And by noon, a news van from the regional NBC affiliate sat parked outside the community center. Word traveled fast in small towns. Faster when it involved elderly people being cheated out of their homes. Lydia sat in Sarah Martinez's rental car, watching through the windshield as cameras were set up on the courthouse steps. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted. "What if I say the wrong thing?" "There is no wrong thing," Sarah assured her. "Just tell your story. Let people see who's really behind this." Through the passenger window, she could see Elias helping Mila out of his truck. The little girl moved with determination despite her braces, clutching a hand-drawn picture to her chest. They'd all gathered for the press conference that would formally announce the class action lawsuit. 12 families represented by one attorney who'd agreed to work pro bono, Supported by 4 men with criminal records and hearts full of stubborn justice, Jonah approached the car, moving with the easy confidence of someone who'd made peace with hard choices. Mrs. Harrow, the reporter wants to talk to you first. Then the other families, keep it simple. Tell them what happened, how it made you feel. What about you all? Are you going to talk to them? If we need to, Reese said from behind Jonah. But this isn't our story. It's yours. The cameras felt enormous, black eyes that would broadcast her words to thousands of strangers. Lydia had never been on television, never spoken to anyone more important than a shift supervisor at the diner. But as she took her place behind the microphone, she felt Robert's button against her ribs and remembered what courage could look like. "My name is Lydia Harrow," she began, her voice steadier than she'd expected. "I'm 63 years old. I've worked as a waitress for most of my life, and 3 days ago, strangers walked into my home and told me it wasn't mine anymore." The reporter, a young woman with kind eyes and a serious expression, nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell us how that made you feel?" Lydia thought about sanitized answers, about not making waves, about all the reasons people like her were supposed to stay quiet. Then, she looked out at the cameras and saw Mrs. Chen in the crowd, saw Mila Rowan holding her father's hand, saw the faces of 11 other families who'd lost everything to paper and lies. "Invisible," she said quietly. "It made me feel invisible. Like I didn't matter enough to be treated honestly." The questions continued. About the documents, about Frank's threats, about the legal process ahead, but what people would remember, what would play on the evening news and spread across social media, was the simple dignity of an elderly woman who refused to disappear. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, Mila approached with her drawing, a crayon masterpiece showing a small blue house surrounded by people holding hands. "This is your house," she explained seriously, "and these are all the people who want to help keep it safe." That afternoon, Frank Murphy's diner was closed by health department order pending investigation. By evening, Meridian Properties had received formal notice of the class action suit. And somewhere in a corporate office in Charlotte, people in expensive suits were having urgent conversations about damage control and legal exposure. But in Maple Ridge, 12 families went to sleep, knowing they weren't fighting alone anymore. The invisible had become impossible to ignore. The Buncombe County Courthouse hadn't seen this much public interest since the mayor's embezzlement trial 5 years earlier. By 8 a.m., the gallery was packed with reporters, residents, and representatives from advocacy groups who'd driven down from Asheville and Charlotte. The air conditioning struggled against the heat generated by too many bodies and too much tension. Judge Patricia Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s who'd seen every kind of fraud and deception the mountains could produce, called the emergency hearing to order with a gavel that sounded like thunder. "This court will review the emergency injunction requests filed by 12 plaintiff families against Meridian Properties and associated entities," she announced. "Counselor Martinez, you may proceed." Sarah Martinez stood with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent weeks building an airtight case. Behind her, the 12 families sat in a row, ordinary people who'd found extraordinary strength and shared purpose. "Your Honor, the evidence will show that the defendants have engaged in systematic foreclosure fraud targeting elderly homeowners throughout western North Carolina. They create false documentation, forge signatures, and exploit loopholes in the legal system to steal homes from vulnerable citizens." The defense attorney, a sharp-suited man from Charlotte whose entire demeanor screamed expensive billable hours, objected immediately. "Your Honor, these are serious accusations without foundation. My clients are legitimate business entities operating within—" "I'll determine what has foundation," Judge Morrison interrupted dryly. "Continue, Ms. Martinez." For the next 2 hours, the courtroom became a classroom in the anatomy of fraud. Sarah presented document after document showing forged signatures, backdated loans, and falsified payment records. Dawson Clive testified about financial irregularities that painted a picture of systematic theft. Bank officials confirmed that payments claimed as missed had actually been processed normally. But it was when Lydia took the stand that the courtroom grew completely silent. "They made me feel like I was crazy," she said, her voice clear despite the microphone's electric hum. "Like I was some confused old woman who couldn't remember her own financial situation. But I've balanced my checkbook every month for 40 years. I know when I've paid my bills." The defense attorney rose for cross-examination, clearly intending to rattle her with aggressive questioning. Instead, he found himself facing a woman who'd spent 3 days remembering what dignity felt like. "Mrs. Harrow, isn't it possible that at your age, with the stress of widowhood and financial pressure, You might have simply forgotten. No, she said simply. It isn't. The exchange that followed was brief and devastating. Every attempt to portray her as confused or unreliable met with calm, factual responses that highlighted the condescension in his questions. By the time he sat down, the jury was looking at him like he'd kicked a kitten. Judge Morrison reviewed the documents with the thoroughness of someone who understood that justice lived in details. When she finally looked up, her expression was thunderous. I find clear and convincing evidence of fraudulent business practices designed to deprive citizens of their lawful property. Emergency injunctions are granted for all 12 properties. Additionally, this court is referring this matter to the State Attorney General for criminal investigation. The gavel fell like a door slamming shut on Meridian Properties' operation. In the gallery, Mrs. Chen wept openly. Mila Rowan clapped her hands despite the formal setting, and Jonah Pike, Reese Calder, Tomas Velez, and Dawson Clive sat quietly, knowing they'd finally paid their debt to Robert Harrow. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Lydia with microphones and cameras, but all she wanted was to go home to her small blue house and sit in Robert's chair and breathe in the scent of her own space. Justice, she discovered, felt a lot like peace. 3 weeks later, Maple Ridge woke to the sound of hammers and electric drills. The community response had been immediate and overwhelming. Lumber donated by Harper's Hardware, paint contributed by the Methodist Church, and enough volunteer labor to rebuild half the town. Lydia stood in her front yard, watching Elias install new shutters while Mila directed operations from her lawn chair, with the authority of someone who'd appointed herself job site supervisor. The blue one goes on the left window, Mila announced, pointing with a paintbrush she wasn't supposed to have. It matches the flowers better. Yes, ma'am, Elias replied solemnly, switching the shutters as ordered. The easy smile on his face was something Lydia had rarely seen before. The expression of a man who'd found his place in the world. Jonah emerged from the basement carrying a toolbox and wearing clothes stained with honest work. New locks are installed, windows are secure, and I replaced that step that's been wobbling since the Carter administration. You didn't have to do all this, Lydia protested for the 10th time that morning. Sure we did, Reese said, appearing with a ladder. Community centers having their monthly potluck next week. Can't have you showing up from a house that needs paint. The settlement had come through faster than anyone expected. Meridian Properties, facing federal fraud charges and a public relations nightmare, had agreed to full restitution for all affected families plus punitive damages. Frank Murphy had been arrested for embezzlement, and the diner was under new management that actually followed labor laws. But for Lydia, the real victory was smaller and larger than money. It was the sound of laughter in her kitchen, as Mrs. Chen taught Mila how to fold dumplings. The sight of Tomas installing grab bars in her bathroom because prevention is the best medicine. The feeling of belonging somewhere again. I've been thinking, she said as the afternoon wore toward evening. About that button Robert gave me. Dawson looked up from where he was teaching Mila about measuring tape. What about it? He said it meant something to good men who remembered debts, but I think he was wrong about who owed what. The work slowed as everyone turned to listen. I think he saw you all struggling and decided to invest in your futures, not because you owed him anything, but because he believed you could become the men you are now. Silence settled over the yard like summer evening light, warm and golden and full of grace. You all saved me, Lydia continued, but not because of some old obligation. You did it because somewhere along the way, you decided that helping people was just what you do now. Mila dropped her measuring tape and hugged Lydia's legs with the unconscious affection of a child who'd never learned to doubt love. Does this mean we're family now? She asked. Lydia looked around at the faces surrounding her. Men who'd walked through fire and chose to become healers. Neighbors who'd found courage in community. A little girl who saw the world as it could be rather than as it was. Yes, sweetheart, she said, her voice steady with certainty. I think it does. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of promise, the small blue house on Pine Street stood sturdy and bright, full of the kind of wealth that couldn't be stolen or forged or taken by legal trickery. It was full of home. Have you ever witnessed a community come together to fight injustice? Share your thoughts on how ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they support each other. Sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we choose to see past someone's history to their heart. What's one act of kindness that changed your perspective on someone? Would you like another story?